Mm? A stand for tomorrow in the quiet, rural town of Briarwood. The red clay roads were lined with oak trees, and the distant hills painted the sky with a soft golden hue every evening. For most of its residents, the town had a timeless feel unchanged through the years. Briarwood, however, wasn't just any town. It was a place where history echoed in the streets, and old grudges still simmered beneath the surface. It was a place where some men had never fully embraced change, where certain ideas about race and power remained frozen in time for Sergeant Calvin Booker. This was a place he had tried to forget. He had fought for his country in several foreign lands, earned a number of medals for bravery, and seen horrors most people couldn't even fathom. When the time came to retire, Calvin came back to Briarwood, hoping to find peace. He married his high school sweetheart, Lydia, and together they built a small life in a modest home on the outskirts of town. They had 2 children, Jamal and Layla, both of whom were growing up to be bright. Curious and full of potential, Briarwood wasn't a town that had welcomed Calvin with open arms. The sting of racism still lingered in the air, even after decades of change across the country. Calvin was a black man, and in Briarwood, there were plenty of people who believed that certain people didn't belong here, no matter what the law said, no matter how many years had passed. Yet Calvin had a certain quiet dignity about him. He didn't fight to change anyone's mind. He was simply living his life, keeping his family safe, and trying to provide them with a future free from the pain he'd experienced growing up in this very town. But there was a part of Briarwood that was still stuck in the past: the Ridgers. A group of white supremacists that had been active in the town for generations. Their influence was strong, their hatred unwavering. Though they had lost their political power over the years, their grip on the underbelly of Briarwood was still felt in the dark corners of bars, alleyways, and private meetings. Calvin had kept his distance from them, but it was impossible to escape their reach forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Calvin sat on the porch of his home, a mug of coffee in hand, reflecting on the peaceful rhythm of life he had built here. Lydia was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Jamal and Layla were playing in the backyard, laughing, their voices filled with joy. He had worked hard to build this life for them, and in his heart, he hoped they would grow up in a world that was fairer than the one he had known. It was a car screeching to a halt that shattered the peace. Calvin's instincts kicked in immediately. He didn't move. He didn't look back at Lydia or the kids. His soldier's mind had already mapped out a plan of action, his eyes scanning the horizon, mentally calculating what could happen next. His years in the military had taught him to think quickly, act decisively. The sound of boots on gravel made his stomach tighten. "Calvin Booker," a voice called out from the shadows. It was the unmistakable drawl of Jim Ridger, leader of the Ridgers, and a man who had made it clear over the years that he didn't think Calvin belonged in Briarwood. Jim, along with a few of his followers, was walking down the long driveway toward the front door. Their faces were grim, their posture aggressive, and their eyes filled with hostility. Calvin didn't move, but his fingers slowly curled around the armrest of his chair. He had heard enough of this group's threats over the years, but tonight, something felt different. There was an edge to their demeanor, an unmistakable malice that was more than just the usual town intolerance. Lydia stepped out onto the porch, sensing the change in the air. "What do they want?" she whispered. Calvin kept his eyes fixed on the men, the weight of years of pent-up anger and frustration rising in his chest. "They've come looking for trouble," he said quietly, though his tone was calm. He didn't want his family to worry, but inside, his military training was kicking into high gear. These men had come to his doorstep, and that was a line he would not allow them to cross. The Ridgers were still advancing, their voices growing louder. Jim Ridger grinned, a sneer playing at the edge of his lips. "I told you before, Booker. This town isn't for your kind. We don't need you and your people here. You think you can just walk around with your head held high, pretending that everything's fine? It's time you learned your place." Calvin rose from his chair, standing tall and steady. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his exterior was a wall of calm. "I've been here long enough to know that I'm not going anywhere." "But you?" "You're about to find out that I'm not afraid of you." Jim's grin faltered for a split second. There was something about Calvin's tone, his unyielding presence, that made him pause. For a moment, he hesitated. But then, his eyes flared with rage. "Are you really going to try to stop us? You think you can threaten us, Calvin?" "We've been through this before," Jim growled, his hand reaching for the gun holstered on his hip. That's when Calvin moved before Jim could even draw his weapon. Calvin was already inside the house. Lydia watched in stunned silence as he quickly retrieved an old rifle from the corner closet, the same one that his father had used to protect their home when Calvin was a boy. It was a tool of survival, a symbol of the resilience of his family. Calvin wasn't just a soldier who had fought for his country. He was a man fighting for the safety of his family, for the legacy of those who came before him. The rifle felt cold against his palms, but his grip was firm, steady. He returned to the porch, stepping forward into the dimming light. His eyes never left Jim Ridger's face. "Stay on your property, Booker," Jim shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He was no longer as certain as he had been moments before. The sight of Calvin standing tall with a rifle in his hands made the air around them heavy. "I told you," Calvin said calmly. "Get off my property. Now." The Ridgers looked at each other, their bravado slipping away as they saw the rifle trained on them. In that moment, it became clear to them that they were no longer dealing with a man they could intimidate. They were dealing with a soldier, a father, a man who had stared down death before and had no intention of backing down. Jim's face contorted in anger, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. The other men took a step back, uneasy. "You don't want this," Calvin added, his voice cold but firm. "This isn't a game. Go back to your shadows, Jim. You've already lost." For a long moment, there was silence. The sound of cicadas chirping filled the air, and the tension hung thick. Finally, Jim's shoulders slumped, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of anger and frustration. "This isn't over, Booker," he spat. But there was no conviction in his words. With a glance at the other men, they turned and began walking back down the driveway. Jim Ridger muttered a curse under his breath as he and his followers disappeared into the darkness. Calvin lowered the rifle, his hands steady, but his heart still racing. He turned and went back inside the house, closing the door behind him. Lydia was standing in the hallway, her face a mix of relief and awe. You scared them off." Calvin nodded, his voice quiet but strong. "I had to." He walked over to his family, gathering Lydia, Jamal, and Layla in his arms. He kissed his children on their foreheads, his mind already working ahead to the future. He knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. But it was a moment where they had fought for their right to live peacefully. And, for now, that was enough. As the night grew darker, Calvin looked out the window, knowing that Briarwood would never be the same. But neither would he. He had made it clear that he was a man not to be trifled with. And in his heart, he knew that no matter what the future held, he would defend his family with everything he had. Because some battles, even when fought with quiet resolve, were the ones that defined who you were.